Worshipful Master, I know that you want to introduce him, but if I might read his bio real quick.
Be so kind.
I'll share with you a personal note as well. I've known Stephen for several years, and in 2007 we were in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and we were sitting around with some friends of ours from his area up in New York, and it was brought to my attention at that time that Stephen was a 9/11 survivor. Prior to that time, I had never heard that. Stephen kept that pretty close to himself and kept pretty quiet about it. He told us that this was something that he didn't really share this story with too many others. In fact, he mentioned at that time that we were really one of the first groups that he had shared some of these details with. And it was a very moving, very inspirational story, as you'll find out here in a few minutes. But it ties into Freemasonry as well, and he'll share that story. As this lecture series has gone on, we've had some very well-known individuals: Chris Hodapp, Right Worshipful Brother Michael Halloran. We've had Trevor Stewart, and about 10 months ago I started thinking about this lecture series for this fall. And I tried to think of an individual who could really bring the heart or the essence of Freemasonry and what our relevance is in society to us in a way that might engage us emotionally, might pull on our heartstrings a little bit. And Stephen came to mind immediately. And I called him knowing that this was something he really didn't like to speak about publicly. And I pleaded with him, and I said, Stephen, it's been 10 years since this tragic event. You have an inspirational story to share, and I think that it's time. And Stephen asked for a couple of days to think about it, and I was very pleased a couple of days later to receive a phone call in which he said that he was ready to share this story. And I'm going to allow the Worshipful Master of Logic Research to read Stephen's bio real quickly and formally introduce him, but it's certainly a pleasure to have him here, and I know that each one of you will find value and encouragement in his words. Worshipful Master.
Thank you. From time to time we have in our individual lives, we remember where we were, for example, when President Kennedy was assassinated, the Challenger, certain other things, certainly 9/11. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be personally involved in something of that nature. We have a generous amount of time, Steve, for you to speak as long as you would like. If I may ask you to share with me simply by reading Steve's Vitale here, and we'll save a little bit of time and give you more time and allow you to speak at this time. Welcome, brother.
Thank you.
I'm honored.
Thank you. Can all you good brothers and friends at the back of the room hear me? Great. Most worshipful, right worshipful, very worshipful, worshipfuls, brothers all, distinguished guests and friends. It is my honor to be here today before you, and I bring the fraternal greetings of the most worshipful Vincent LeBone, Grand Master of Masons of the state of New York, as well as the good brothers of St. John's Lodge No. 1 Ancient York Masons, my mother lodge. I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about my experiences at Ground Zero and how that day really was the first day of a journey that led me to the doors of Freemasonry and ultimately to self-discovery. My name is Steve Vitale, and I am a survivor of the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center that took place on September 11th, 2001. As we've reached the 10-year anniversary of this terrible but historic event, I'm glad to see more people stepping up to give a different account of that day than is usually portrayed by the media. Too often over the past several years, I've seen the media focus solely on the terrible images and sad stories resulting from the crimes committed by terrorists against the innocent people of our country that day. Consequently, I will not be showing you any of the pictures that I took at Ground Zero that day, or even recount the sins I witnessed against thousands of people who died there that day. Instead, I'm here today to share with you a different story, a story of hope that revolves around how the heroic actions of all the people that day changed my life forever. The actions of the heroic people I saw on September 11th not only changed my life, but also caused me to search for more meaning in my life, a search that also led me to the doors of Freemasonry. It is in honor of those people that I'm here telling you my tale and paying forward the good deeds and heroic actions demonstrated to me that day. There came a moment in my life approximately 10 years ago when I stopped and considered who I was at that point in time. I was the youngest division head at Morgan Stanley, a premier Wall Street investment banking firm, and had achieved at a very young age a level of success that most people only read about in books. However, as I stood in front of a mirrored elevator door waiting to go home, I realized that I did not know or even like the person I saw in the mirror. I wondered how I'd become this empty, weak shell of a person. In a way, I was like a shattered mirror, and the glass shards were simply reflecting the perceptions others had of who they thought I was as a person. I started to realize that for many years I had lost myself and allowed society and other people to shape and drive the direction of my life. At that moment, I felt utterly lost and was not sure how or if I could ever change my life. I will always remember that moment because it took place in the World Trade Center on my way home from work on the evening of Monday, September 10th, 2001. And fate was about to step in and change the course of both my life and history. The morning of Tuesday, September 11th was like any other typical late summer day. I got up for work, dressed, ate, and kissed my wife and newborn daughter before leaving to catch the express train into New York City. That particular morning, I was making a presentation to some coworkers on the 81st floor of World Trade Center, Tower number 2. Everything was normal, and I had already forgotten the concerns of the prior evening. Then, my world changed forever. There was a loud explosion, and our building shook as if there had been a small earthquake. When I got up, I quickly followed everyone into one of the conference rooms. The offices and conference rooms that made up the exterior wall of the World Trade Center were all glass, so you could see everything that was happening. When I looked out the window of the conference room, I could see fire and black smoke billowing from Tower number 1, which was only about 100 feet away. That was when I came to learn a plane had crashed into Tower 1. There must have been a dozen people in that conference room. Almost half never made it out alive. Fortunately, a coworker I barely knew grabbed me as he ran toward one of the stairwells. As I ran down the stairs, I recall security guards telling us to go back to our office, as everything would be okay. My coworker and I made it to the 4th floor when suddenly there was an even greater explosion that shook the ground from under my feet. That was when the second plane hit World Trade Center Tower number 2. I recall falling and tumbling all the way to the 1st floor, where I lied under a pile of approximately 20 other people. As I started to panic because I was pinned by the weight of the bodies, I recall seeing a hand reach out to me. A policeman had come in and was quietly and calmly helping people up and out to safety. I clearly recall his calm demeanor and smile, which made me feel safe in what was otherwise a terrifying moment for me. By the time I exited the stairwell and entered the underground shopping area of the World Trade Center, everything was already on fire. I stood around and looked at all the familiar places in the World Trade Center that I had known and visited over the years. Despite the falling debris and fires that were only a few feet away from me, I would never have moved if not for a fireman who had just run in to the building from a nearby escalator. This fireman quickly walked over and asked me my name, and then he held my hand and walked me out the building. As I stood outside looking around at all the debris and fire, I recall being amazed at how well everyone was working together. Although the police, fire department, and emergency medical units were all busy assisting the injured, it was the regular people standing in the street that caught my attention. Men and women of all race, creed, and color were walking over and helping people out of the building, giving them water and attending to their needs. I remember seeing a homeless man with a cart walk over and hug a woman in a business suit who had been weeping alone on the corner of the West Side Highway. In the midst of all the terror and fear, I was overwhelmed by the acts of love, fraternity, and genuine humanity being displayed by strangers for their fellow human beings in need. At that moment, something happened that no one there would have ever imagined possible. There was a terrible, piercing alien noise that everyone in the vicinity instantly realized signaled that the Trade Center was collapsing. I've rarely felt such fear as I did that moment, faced with my own mortality. My immediate, uncontrolled instinct was to run as fast as I could down the West Side Highway away from the buildings. As I ran, I could see people leaping off the pier that was across the street from the Trade Center and into the Hudson River. It looked as if the World Trade Center would fall over on top of us all. As I continued to run, I saw an image that speaks to me even today. As the building collapsed and we all ran away for our dear lives, there were dozens of men and women, mostly in uniform, who were actually running towards the collapsing tower. These men and women mainly represented our local police and fire departments and were willing to face certain death in order to try to help those in need. Despite their fear and the image of the collapsing skyscraper, they found the moral courage to act. Never have I been witness to such an act of heroism. No, it was more than heroism. These people were displaying the very best in humanity. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, they were being the change they wanted to see in the world. The World Trade Center collapsed, and despite my efforts, I could not outrun the rushing cloud of smoke, ash, and debris. I hid under a small truck until the initial blast of the collapse passed. As I got up from under the truck to seek safer shelter, I recalled that I could not see anything. For a moment, I felt despair, because I was not sure how I would find my way out of the blackness. In that moment, I saw a brilliant light in the distance. I instinctively walked towards it and thanked God for sending me a miracle in the form of a rescuer. As I got closer, I was able to make out the form of a woman who had a face mask and a flashlight. Suddenly, I saw a dozen regular people with flashlights and makeshift masks that were walking into the blackness in order to help anyone like me who had been stranded. As I was taken into a nearby building and given water and medical attention, I recalled wondering if I was capable of such acts of altruism. I suddenly felt the circumstances of the moment calling to me. I wanted to be worthy of the acts of kindness and love that had been shown to me that day. I knew I was a good man, but I wanted to be better. The days and weeks that passed following that day were eerily quiet for me, as New York City had been closed off, and Morgan Stanley had asked its employees to stay home for a few weeks. When I returned to work, it was only to find out that my startup business group was being shut down as a result of the economic uncertainty, and I was being laid off. I recall coming home with absolutely no idea how I would support my family or how I would even pay the mortgage for my new home that I had just purchased. Despite being laid off from my job shortly after the tragic destruction of the World Trade Center, with no means of supporting my family, I was not scared or even sad. I felt strangely happy and excited for the first time in many years. The closest thing that I could associate with my frame of mind at that time was a distinct sense of exhaling. Having a corner office and working for a Wall Street firm like Morgan Stanley had been a goal, which symbolized the epitome of financial and monetary success. I had let one aspect of my life, my career, rule and govern me. Achieving that level of financial success had been such a hard-fought goal that when I achieved it, I would not let myself see how unhappy this job and situation was making me. It was not the company that was making me unhappy. It was the way I was living my life. I put financial success ahead of my family and myself. At the time, I rationalized that I was working so hard for the financial well-being of my family, despite the fact that I barely ever saw them. So, despite being deathly unhappy, I would never have left that job had I not been laid off after the collapse of the Trade Center. In the weeks following my dismissal from Morgan Stanley, I discovered the source of my newfound happiness. My subconscious was telling me this was my opportunity to find a happy human being of my youth that I had forgotten. I realized that I could and would try to be more like the heroic people at Ground Zero who had proven themselves worthy of the title human beings. I noticed in the days that followed that I had found a hidden source of strength, happiness, resolve, which allowed me to make decisions that drove the momentum of my life in a different and more positive direction. I began to prioritize my life and found I now had the time to do the things I had always wanted to do. I enjoyed my family, found a job that was both personally and financially rewarding, began training for the marathon, and volunteered my time for philanthropy. However, Despite my best efforts to do more and volunteer time, spend time with my family, I still seemed unable to define myself. I still didn't know who I was. I was a good man, but I wanted to be better. I began to reach out to people I respected to see if they could point me in the right direction. As a result, I came in contact with many wonderful people who also seemed to emulate the best of humanity. As I got to know some of these people better, I found that many of them were Freemasons. Freemasonry was something that I'd heard but knew very little about. Despite its veil of mystery, Freemasonry also seemed to call the very best within people. It was not just that these Freemasons volunteered their time or gave financially to worthy causes. It was not just the fun and fraternity displayed at their dinners and events, which, by the way, were a lot of fun. No, these men were different. As a young business professional, I already volunteered my time with charities and met a lot of nice and interesting people over dinner. These men, these Masons, were more like modern-day philosophers who were unafraid to talk about such noble concepts as balance in life, integrity, fortitude, prudence, and justice. These were words I rarely used in my day-to-day life. So I took a leap of faith and met with my current lodge and eventually petitioned for membership. Within a year, I started to notice that I was transforming into the person that I always wanted to be. My initiation to Freemasonry was a powerful thing in the sense that I had absolutely no idea what it all meant and how it applied to me. However, I memorized its rituals verbatim and learned its customs with the hope that there was a greater force at work within the words of the ritual that would unlock some meaning within my life. It was not until after I had become a Master Mason that I really started to consider what Freemasonry meant to me. I had been asked to memorize a piece of ritual for my good friend Jason Sheridan, who was being installed as Master of our lodge. The piece was long, and it was to be presented in front of 100 people. I was nervous and began to start memorizing it a few months before the event. The piece discussed the working tools of Freemasonry and their symbolic meaning. I happened to be training for the marathon at the time and decided to start to memorize it during my long 15-mile runs. After a while, I started to sense some resonance between my desire to shape and improve my physical form by training for the marathon and the words of the ritual, which discussed a Mason's, no, better yet, simply a man's work to distill himself. It was during one of those 15-mile runs that I suddenly realized what Freemasonry was to me and why I had joined. I like to think that my subconscious was trying to tell me that there was something more to me, more simple or even basic and divine than just being an investment banker or a Hispanic American or a white man or an American man. I realized that I am who I want to be. That definition is more basic and divine than any that I had limited myself to previously. I thought back to September 11th and how race, creed, and color played no part in the actions of the heroes who saved the lives or gave up their lives for the good of others. I remember how there was almost an unspoken feeling of camaraderie or fraternity that day amongst all the people at Ground Zero. It was a pure, almost divine sense of being connected that allowed people to let go of the label society placed on them and simply act with love and kindness. The fraternity and brotherhood within Freemasonry tries to inspire us to act with that level of community and love every day of our lives. As the years passed, my appreciation for Freemasonry grew. Freemasonry had grounded me when I was lost. It opened its doors and gave me a community where I could learn to be a better man among the fraternity of brothers. And it even helped me come to a better understanding of who I was as a person. However, I still wondered if I could rise up and demonstrate the same level of altruism, of charity, as the people at Ground Zero had showed me that day all those years ago. I was still waiting for something to happen so that I could test myself and all the tools that Freemasonry had given me. That opportunity came the day I received a disheartening email from a brother of another lodge asking for alms to benefit a fellow Mason and fireman whose wife had died and 2 infant daughters were paralyzed for life as a result of a drunk driving car accident. It is in these uncertain times such as ours that people feel as if their actions have no impact or resonance on the world around them. Up until that moment, Up until the moment I received that email, I was just like those people, but no longer. I believe that it does not take Herculean efforts or millions of dollars to make a difference in our lives. The smallest intent followed by action can make a difference. I thought about how so many people are quick to say they will rise up and act against the major evils of the world, but those same people will ignore the everyday, mundane ones that are right in front of them. The pain, suffering, and most of all the helplessness of those two little girls was a pain that I could and would not suffer to ignore. After strong prayer for these little girls, I needed to do something to benefit or alleviate their suffering. With the help of the brothers of my lodge, we held a charitable event that raised $1,000. We collected food, clothing, and supplies. We reached out to friends as well as brothers of other lodges to help us aid this family in distress. When we went to give the money to the father of the children, I recognized the face of the man. He was a fireman who had been one of the firemen who had helped me the day of September 11th. He had been with one of the fire companies that had come from outside of the New York City area to help at Ground Zero. He did not recognize me, but I remembered him. In that moment, he was filled with happiness as he received several checks and offers to help from my lodge and several others that day. He and his little girls were visibly overwhelmed with joy, but not because of the money or gifts, but because of the love, kindness, and fraternity that they were witnessing. I suddenly realized the simple truth that I could have a positive impact on the lives of the people around me. If I wanted to emulate the love, compassion, and charity that I witnessed on September 11th, I could not passively wait for a tragedy to arrive. No. I needed to live my life every day in a manner that had a positive impact on the world around me. Freemasonry had taught me that I should live my life under a code of ethical and virtuous behavior. It taught me that I could be the change I want to see in the world. I just needed to have the power of will to take action and act on my good intentions. All of us have good intentions, but it takes a certain moral courage to act on them. Like the brave uniformed heroes of 9/11, I understood it was not always going to be easy to do the right thing. However, I realize now that I could change the course of people's lives in a positive way. I just needed to act. The power of that truth changed the way I lived my life and would help me understand how our uniformed heroes could find the courage to do the right thing. On the drive back from the fireman's home, I recalled a quote that one of our newly raised brothers in our lodge had said after receiving the sublime degree of Master Mason. He said, "What shall we do with this awakening? Like all great teachers throughout time who have received the good word, we go back to the cave and yell into its blackness." At the time, I thought I knew what he meant by the quote, but it was not until that day at the fireman's home, looking at the faces of those two little girls, that I came to my own understanding of that phrase. The actions of the brave men and women at Ground Zero on September 11th had awakened something in me that caused me to search for greater meaning in my life. That search led me to Freemasonry, where I found the tools to break off the superfluous and rough edges of my life. But now that I had shaped my life and heart into something worth building upon, what would I do with this awakening? I'll tell you what I'll do. I would pay it forward and live my life every day to the best of my ability in a way that had a positive impact on the world around me. In the same way that the heroes of September 11th inspired me, I hope to inspire the best in others through my words and actions. Through my actions, I would perpetuate the living chain of light of which I am but one small link. In conclusion, this journey that I have taken that started at Ground Zero on September 11th, and the Masonic studies I have undertaken have given birth to a spiritual light which appeared from the cracked and broken remains of my mundane and material life, of which I had lost myself. It is in this light from which I discovered the following blueprint. My life had been idle and stagnant, lost in a material prison of which I was unaware. In the darkest hour, both literally and figuratively, a light shone as if trying to steer me back on course. From that day on, I've worked to rebuild myself in order to emulate that light, which is the light of love, kindness, and human compassion. To my surprise, the very actions I took to rediscover this part of myself gave birth to the very thing that I was searching for within myself. I am reborn and reawakened, and am now both man and Freemason in action. When needed, I can and will use the tools given to me by Freemasonry to make positive change in this world. The events of September 11th were to me a paradigm shift in the way I saw my world and myself. Freemasonry provided me the tools to change and become more like the heroes I witnessed at Ground Zero. So as we look back and reflect now upon the 10-year anniversary of the events of September 11, 2001, I say Freemasonry is more relevant now than ever. Freemasonry will not deposit knowledge into the soul, but will point the soul toward right living. In that respect, Freemasonry can continue to be a force of good, helping good men like me and you become better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.